Hi, welcome to our ProAV Academy series on tech terms, where we sit down with Alister Chapman and chat through some of the technical terms that just come up again and again in this industry. Alister is one of the best people I know at explaining complex technical concepts, so hopefully, just by casually chatting with him each one of these terms through, these videos can just help clear up some of the confusion that might be out there on each of these terms. Today we're talking about RAW recording, what it can do and when you should use it. So in the stills world, RAW capture is used a huge amount, and now in the video world, it's been used at the high end, but it's now seeping throughout the rest of the industry. So what makes RAW different from normal codecs?
Well, normally when we record with a conventional codec in a camera, we're taking the data from the sensor, converting it into a color picture, perhaps making some changes with a matrix or gamma curve or whatever, but what we're doing is recording a full color processed image.
Sure.
With RAW, what we're doing is we're getting rid of all the processing, and we're essentially just trying to take what comes off the sensor, or as close to that as we can get, with as little processing as possible, and recording that so that we can then take it into post-production and a computer and do all the processing that would normally occur in the camera later on. So the big benefit there is by doing the processing later on is that we have a lot more scope for changing the look of the image. We can apply our gamma curve later, we can apply our color science later. So we're not tying ourselves into a specific look or range in the camera by processing in the camera and then recording it. By doing the processing later in a computer, we can do much more with it later on and take advantage of the fact that most computers have a lot more processing power than your average camera does. So it's a very powerful workflow.
Absolutely. I mean, how fair is it to do that similarity and that comparison to the stills world? Is it essentially exactly the same thing?
It's more or less is the same thing, yes. I mean, in the stills world, you're taking what comes off the sensor. Generally what happens in a stills camera is it will, so you have the ability to change ISO and things like that on the camera, and that's actually stored then as metadata along with the data from the sensor, so that when you bring it into your software to develop the RAW, it applies the metadata so that what you see on the screen is pretty much how it looked on the back of the camera when you took the picture. With a RAW video camera, it's broadly similar. It depends on your workflow and the software tools that you're using to, let's call it, develop the image in the computer, as to how much of that metadata that the camera does record is read and used. But yeah, it's broadly similar. In an F55 with Sony's Venice, all the metadata about white balance, about ISO and Cine EI and things like that, LUT, are all there. And when you take it into Resolve as an example, it processes the image according to that metadata. You then have the ability, though, to turn off the metadata and actually change the image your own way. So if you want to change your exposure, you can do it in post-production within reason, but you have a tremendous flexibility in post that you don't have with conventional recordings. And the other big thing about RAW is it's actually inherently very efficient. So we're talking about Bayer sensors here, where they record in the case of a 4K Bayer sensor, records 4096 by 2160 pixels, and that is what's often termed as 4K. I would argue that it's 4K of pixels, and that's about it. In the camera, that gets turned into then our color image. So instead of just being one lot of 4096 by 2160 pixels, it becomes three lots of pixels. In a UHD recording, 3840 by 2160 for red, green, and blue, or Y, CB, and CR. So it becomes 3 times bigger. But because we're not doing that processing, we're not turning it into a color picture, we're just taking the raw sensor information, it stays small. So RAW is actually quite efficient. And then with modern cameras or external recorders, we can then compress it as well. We can actually apply a codec basically to the RAW. So we can take something that's quite small relatively speaking, to start off with, compress it to make it even smaller, and what we end up with is a very, very efficient way of recording what comes out of the camera.
I guess a very efficient way of recording a very high quality, because I think a lot of people, I mean, if you compare it down to 100 megabits a second sort of compressed 8-bit footage from your A7S or anything like that, you know, RAW is always going to be a lot larger. But in terms of the quality difference between them, that's where, as you say...
Well, RAW isn't always necessarily larger. I think there's a little bit of a misconception there. I mean, going back a few years, then yes, RAW was almost inevitably always larger because it wasn't compressed as it is today. It really did just take the data from the sensor, typically 12-bit, 16-bit, record that, and you did end up with some pretty big files. But if we look at Sony's XOCN codec, which is very, very similar, remarkably similar to RAW in the way that works, that essentially is doing something very similar. We're taking the sensor data, excuse me, we're making it smaller, and then we're recording it. And XOCN is no bigger than XAVC, yet we have all that flexibility of a RAW type recording. So ProRes RAW is another great example where we take the image from the sensor, and that could be a FS5, FS7, or cameras from other manufacturers as well, to an Atomos recorder, and that's compressed using ProRes RAW, and it's roughly the same size as a conventional ProRes recording. It's certainly not really any bigger, yet we have all of that goodness of taking the direct information from the sensor. So I think there's a bit of a misconception that RAW these days is always bigger. It's not necessarily bigger, but you have much greater flexibility in post. The downside really is, I guess, that because it's raw data, it isn't a colour signal, is it requires post-production work. It's a little bit like log. If you shoot with log, you have to grade it. If you shoot with RAW, not only do you have to grade it, but you also have to first convert it into a colour picture to be able to grade it. So the computer has to work a lot harder. Having said that, modern computers with very good graphics cards, because it's the graphics card that plays such an important role with working with RAW, not the processor, not the CPU, that's reasonably important too, but your graphics card takes that raw data, converts it into a color picture, and if you've got a good graphics card, that will all happen in real time and seamlessly. It's not really something you want to do on a small old laptop computer, but you know, a decent workstation in most edit suites, or even a home studio, should these days be quite capable of working with RAW more or less in real time, and it's much easier to work with these days than it used to be.
So do we think RAW is just going to be like it is, to be honest, in the photography world, where if you can shoot RAW, unless you're really up against it and you know you don't want to edit it at all, in stills world you shoot RAW, really? Do we think in video it is all going to move towards that? Or is there still going to be situations when normal video recording is still absolutely going to be the right way to go?
I think ultimately, but it's some way down the line, that we will do everything with RAW. It's going to need a bit of work from the post-production software writers and the camera manufacturers to come up with a common metadata set, so that you can take the RAW from any camera into almost any edit software, and it's all going to look the way it's supposed to look. I think that there's a lot of work to be done there to make all that happen the way it's supposed to happen. But I think, ultimately that's where we will end up, where cameras will shoot RAW. It's just inherently efficient. It gives you so much more flexibility in post, and automatically the software will convert it to a color picture. So if you are doing that fast turnaround project, on the surface it won't look any different to the way you shoot now. You'll shoot with the camera and a picture will come out that's a generic look at the other end. In the meantime, between now and then, I think what we will see is a great increase in the use of RAW. I think ultimately log will, I don't want to say die a death, but I think log will be what's affected most, and that we'll see log in the next 5 or 10 years largely disappear, because log was a stopgap. Log was a way of taking that color picture and encoding it in such a way that it becomes manageable, taking a big dynamic range and making it manageable in post-production with the tools that we have today. I think log will eventually go away and be replaced by raw.
So there's definitely still a point of confusion there, because you can still enable log when your camera is set to raw mode. So let's explain what's going on there a little bit.
Yeah, so that's mostly actually about monitoring and being able to view the image. So if we look at what the raw is, it is the raw sensor data. So in the case of a Bayer sensor, it's not even a color picture. It is a black and white image. I'm using the term image loosely, but it is an image, but you've got red pixels or pixels that represent what's red or the brightness of red next to green, so it would be really grainy, it wouldn't have any gamma, so it would be something that's completely unviewable, and you certainly wouldn't be able to make any sensible judgment on color or brightness or anything like that if you looked at the raw signal in its raw state. So to be able to have something that you can monitor, the most common way of doing it with most cameras is to convert the raw in the camera to log that you can then either apply a lookup table to, or you can convert it to 709 with your monitor, or however you wish to do it. So you have to do something to the raw in the camera to make it viewable. So that's why we normally have log or something else available in the camera. Then that raw data itself is what we actually want to record. And because we're just recording it and transporting it to our grading suite, it doesn't matter what it is at that point. So that's why you end up with both in the camera.
I guess you've also got to have a starting point for your post-production work. You've got to have a starting point.
Yes, because that's the other thing, is you then in post-production, of course, that raw signal comes into post-production, and it has to be converted into something, again, that's viewable. And you could convert it direct to 709, or because most people are then familiar with working with LUTs, you've got to have a known reference to add your LUT to. So the convenient one is to convert it to something like S-Log3, because that's what people have got LUTs for. And of course then that comes back to the camera as well, because when you were shooting in RAW, your camera would have been set to S-Log3 or log, and then you can apply an S-Log3 LUT to it in the camera, and then the same LUT in post-production applied to the RAW after it's been converted to S-Log3 gives you the same looking image. It's important to understand, though, that very often that S-Log3 bit in post-production is merely a convenient term or level that's used so that you, the end user, actually kind of understands the workflow. That actually, in terms of the image processing that's going on, the footage never actually becomes S-Log3. The post-production software will know that the S-Log3 does this calculation, or the S-Log3 LUT does this calculation. To get from RAW to S-Log3, there's this other calculation. And it combines those two calculations and does it in one go. So it works on that direct data, does the two S-Log3 calculation and the LUT calculation together as one process to give the final output. So you are always working generally from the original data rather than the intermediate log. It can get quite complicated getting your head around all of this stuff. But I genuinely believe in the future it's how we'll do everything, because once the metadata and everything else is sorted out, it would be transparent to the end user. And you'd have a 709 output if that's what you want, but then if you decide you need an HDR output, you just flick a switch and you've got HDR, and if you want some other one, you just change another setting and you've got that, all from one file.
It makes a huge amount of sense to have as little baked in during the actual video capture as possible.
Yeah, and I mean, historically, if you look back at what video workflows used to be, it used to be, we didn't have all the post-production tools that we have today. You had a tape-to-tape edit system. You couldn't make the changes that we have now. So you had to record what the picture was going to look like at the end, because we didn't have all these computers to manipulate it after it came out of the camera. So that became the traditional workflow, was to work with something that looked the way it was always going to look. And then we kind of got a halfway house with computer-controlled vision mixers and things that could manipulate brightness, contrast, saturation. But we've always sort of started with this already color picture. But now the computing power has changed so dramatically, there really is no need to do that anymore. We don't need to turn it into that color picture and record that in the camera. Recording media is much cheaper than it used to be. It's much faster. So it's going to become ever easier just to record what comes off that sensor in the camera, and cheaper. It's going to make it easier to make lower cost cameras if you haven't got to do so much processing in the camera.
True.
That's why a lot of camera manufacturers, we've got a lot of the smaller companies now, and the only reason they can exist is because they don't do all of this processing in the camera. They just record what comes off the sensor. And then we take that into post-production, where we've got this lovely big computer with lots and lots of number crunching, and we can do it all there. And it makes sense that that's the way things will go in the future, and that will be how we shoot. We will shoot raw.
Thanks for watching. I hope that was helpful. Keep in mind, we also do a whole range of ProAV Academy workshops held right here in our UK showroom, where we cover a whole range of topics, from audio to post-production, camera techniques, business tips, lighting tips, and many more. The main aim of these workshops is to help our customers learn and develop their skills. And there's something about face-to-face training which can just never be replaced by videos like this one. So if you're in the UK, please do get a ticket from the link down below and join us for ProAV Academy.